Welcome to today's PVFF Beginners Fly Tying for the month of August. In the past several months, our classes have been predominantly patterns, fly patterns, that imitate aquatic or terrestrial insects. Today, our fly pattern represents perhaps a minnow, a worm, or a leech. I'm going to refer to this fly pattern today, as you would find in our latest newsletter, as the Curly Tailed Jig. I'd like to also pause for a minute and talk about my familiarity with fishing with jigs and tying or tying with jigs. Now, for years, when I would be fishing with a spinning rod for smallmouth bass in Canada, I often used a lead-headed jig, like the one that I'm going to show you right now. This would be a typical rubber-tailed jig tied on or inserted on to a jig hook, heavy-weighted lead-headed jig hook, which makes it easy to cast with something like a spinning rod. Later, when I took up fly fishing for basically all species, a club member of ours with PVFF, Tommy Marks, shared his Curly Tailed Jig, a pattern, and I took this pattern with me, as well as several of my friends did too, in our annual trip to Quebec to fish for smallmouth bass. This is what Tommy Marks' Curly Tailed Jig looks like. Very similar in terms of style to the rubber standard jig that's used with a spinning rod. The Curly Tailed Jig is tied much like the classic Bob Clouser deep minnow. And what I mean by that, it is tied in an inverted manner with either bead chain eyes or dumbbell eyes tied on virtually on the top of the fly, which causes the fly to invert when you cast it, and it will ride upside down in the water, and makes this manner of tying provides the fly with almost weedless type of property, as well as in stripping the fly through the water. You're getting a lot of motion from the curly tail as well as from these rubber types of fibers that are protruding from the top of the fly. So when tied with a rubber tail, the fly has this inherent lifelike action similar to that of a worm, an aquatic worm or minnow, or even a leech as it's swimming through the water. So today I'm going to tie the Tommy Marks version of this fly, as well as a variant which I have tied in the past for some of the smallmouth bass fishing, which I have also done with a jig type of fly, and that is one tied with a piece of rabbit strip at the end rather than the rubber. And I just refer to this as a rabbit strip jig. But as you can see, it has very similar characteristics to the type of fly that was developed and I mentioned already by Tommy Marks. Both of these fly patterns, when tied in various sizes and various colors, provides the fly fisher with a small arsenal of flies for panfish through larger species of fish such as smallmouth and largemouth bass. Now these two flies are awesome on ponds and rivers and lakes during the hot summer months such as we have right now. Now before going any further and beginning to tie, I'm going to introduce the materials that we're going to be using today. Of course, we're going to be using a wide gap streamer hook, such as this one here. And this is in a size 6. We're going to be using cactus chenille for the body of the fly. We're going to be using rubber Hyperflex Curly Tail, which are sold by Fly Shack, as well as Dynafloss, which provides further movement to the fly, also sold by Fly Shack. The other feature that I'm going to add to this fly is a bright red collar, which probably creates sort of a strike feature for the fish, for them to focus on, which may represent the gills of a minnow, or even a hot spot on the fly itself, whether it represents to the fish a worm or even a leech. To begin, of course, we're going to pinch down the barb on the hook, as we traditionally do, to make it easier to extract from the fish as well as from ourselves in the event that we would get a hook stuck in our hand or arm or something like that. There's been several instances in my days of fishing when having a barbless hook has sort of saved the day. In fact, at one time in Canada, I hooked one of my fly fishing guides in the cheek on a windy day, and he very easily removed the hook from his cheek, and I was somewhat embarrassed, but at least we didn't have to stop our fishing. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to begin my thread just slightly behind the eye of the hook, wrap it back approximately 1/4 of an inch, and then build up a little bump of thread right at this location, which will actually provide some support to the eye of the eye on the fly, which the dumbbell eyes. And then the eyes are placed across the top of the hook, and several wraps are made going from back to front, and then reversing it going from in the other direction. I will turn that so that it's clear to the camera what I'm doing. And these I refer to as X wraps. So I do about 6 of those, and then I do a circular wrap, which is above the shank of the hook and around the beads. And I can also demonstrate it this way. So these I refer to as circular wraps. So I do that twice, and this is typical of the way that Bob Clouser would tie in the eyes of almost all of the patterns that he has developed. So I'm basically using the Clouser style of tying in these eyes. Again, about 6 X wraps, and then about 6 circular wraps, tightening it down, creating a relatively tight bond between the hook shank and the dumbbell eyes. I'm going to stop at this point and just put a touch of cement on there, just to further secure the eyes of the fly onto the hook. And that can dry while we're proceeding with the fly. At this point, we can continue wrapping the thread to the rear in order to tie in the tail, the curly tail on this curly tailed jig. Notice that I'm stopping just at the point, almost directly above the point of the hook, or just at the start of the bend of the shank of the hook. I then take a section of the rubber curly tail and I lay that on the near side of the shank of the hook, just where this section, which I'll refer to as the butt ends of the curly tail, just about where it begins to open up and create a little bit wider portion of this rubberized material. So I lay it along the near side of the fly to me, and then sort of using a lateral pinch wrap, I just tie it down the shank of the hook until I get to a point where I can clip off this excess. And then return the wraps back the shank of the hook to that starting place. So I've already pre-cut a 3-inch piece of this cactus chenille. I will strip off a little bit at the very beginning. And notice that the fibers of the cactus chenille are going towards my left hand or sticking to the back of the shank of the hook. So I will tie this in with several thread wraps just at the same location where my thread is currently hanging. A couple wraps there, and then wrap it forward. And then a few wraps back so that it's very, very tightly secured to the shank of the hook. Then I'm going to advance my thread all the way forward around the shank of the hook, stopping about perhaps 1/4 of an inch behind the eyes of the fly. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is very important. First of all, I'm going to secure my thread at this place with just 1/2 hitch so that I can hold that thread out of the way in order to wrap this cactus chenille around the shank of the hook. Notice what I'm doing at this point. I'm going to make a single wrap around the shank of the hook, and in doing so I'm going to be pulling back on these fibers so that they're laying back and not laying forward. So I will hold that back with my left hand and make one wrap, and as I come around for my second wrap, I will pull the fibers back again and again. So with each wrap, I'm pulling back the fibers from the previous wrap. This has two effects then. It makes for a nice uniform body, as well as it makes the so-called abdomen of the fly a little bit more rotund, a little bit fatter. So you're getting the best bang for the buck, so to speak, out of your chenille. It's not being trapped by the successive wraps of it upon itself. Now when I have advanced almost to about, as I said before, 1/4 of an inch behind the eye of the dumbbell eyes of the fly, then I secure that piece of cactus chenille with 2 thread wraps behind and then 2 thread wraps in front, and then I can clip that off. So we now have the tail as well as the abdomen of the fly complete. The next thing I'm going to do is select about 4 fibers of this Dynafloss material to be tied in on the upside, or I guess it would be considered the downside when the fly is in this position, or the upside when the fly is in the inverted position. So I'm going to cut off several of these fibers from the rest of the bundle. Now I'm going to invert my fly this way to tie it in, but if you do not have a rotary vise, it's just as easy to tie it in from the other side. I said I was going to use 4 fibers, and in fact I did not cut 4, so I will cut 2 more. So I'll demonstrate what I was just saying. If you have a rotary vise, you can simply wrap the Dynafloss around the hook, slide around the thread, slide it up on top of the hook, and secure it as such. But if you don't have a rotary vise, the same principle can be applied if you have the fly in the vise in this manner. But the important thing is that this material is applied on the bend side of the hook, not on the top. And that is because when the fly is being stripped through the water, it's going to be in this position, and we want these fibers to be sticking up towards the point of the hook. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, if you don't have a rotary vise, again, wrap the rubber fibers around the thread, slide it up the thread right to the bottom of the fly, make several wraps, and there are your materials in place. Now, it can be tied to extend back by making a couple wraps over the bundle on the underside. I want to hold the whole bundle back so that I can actually anchor the whole bundle in place. All right. At this point, the fly can be finished off with a whip finisher. And the next thing we will do is be putting in a red collar, which again makes a strike feature to the fly that will sometimes get the fish's attention. So I've switched to the red thread. I think anything that would be sort of a change in color, orange, different types of materials that would accent the collar of the fly would be just fine for this. And again, I'm whip finishing it at this point. Okay. Now a touch of cement at that point would also help. And the fly is complete. Again, we're going to start this Rabbit Strip Jig fly, and I have already pinched down the barb of the hook, but just to be sure, I'm going to pinch it down again for the same reason as I stated before with the Curly Tailed Jig, and that is to make it easier to release the fish, or to make it easier to release it from your own self or your fishing partner. We're going to be using this time an orange thread because it's basically concealed by the crystal flash material. I'm going to be using a piece of crystal flash which is in a dark olive color. The tail on the fly is going to be what's called speckled olive rabbit strip. Now, if you're not already familiar with this, if the fibers on the rabbit strip are going with in the same direction as the underside, the leather part, then it's called a zonker. If it's protruding at a 90-degree angle from the hide, it's called crosscut. And you need to make that distinction because if you are tying the body of a fly, you want crosscut so that the fibers stick out at 90 degrees. But if you're tying the tail on a fly, you want to use zonker strip. And so I'm using zonker strip at this particular point. And when I get to that aspect of the fly, I will describe how I prepared this piece of zonker strip. But I have chosen about a 3-inch piece of rabbit strip that will be the abdomen. Of course, the rubber hackle part of the fly is the same Dynafloss in an olive color that we used. Actually, this is referred to by the company Fly Shack as their peacock fly. So those are the materials, much like that were used for the very first fly, except that instead of the curly tail, we will be having a fly with a rabbit strip tail. All right. The first thing I'm going to do, as I did before, would be to start the thread immediately behind the eye of the hook and wrap it back a short distance until I've created then a bump of thread, which is going to, again, as I mentioned before, support the bead chain eyes of the hook, on the hook. And again, we want to tie this bead chain in on the top of the hook as it's sitting in the vise. I'm going to make front to rear wraps, about 6 in that direction, then just slightly move the bead chain to line it up, and then make back to front wraps, again about 6 times, and then above the shank or circular wraps, again I'm tightening after each several wraps, I tighten a little bit, draw that down, and then another series of 4 to 6 wraps one direction, the other direction, making those X wraps, and then about the same number of circular wraps around the shank of the hook. So that eye is now pretty firmly attached, but as I mentioned before, I'm just going to put a drop of cement. And this is basically super glue, Gorilla super glue that you can get in most craft stores or hardware stores, and it works just as well as some of the more specialized types of epoxies or super glues that you find in some of the fly fishing catalogs. So your choice whether you want to save money or go with a brand name. So now the next thing that I'm going to do is where this pattern differs from last. I'm going to make a bump of thread at that same position where I stopped the rearward motion in the previous fly. And I'm going to secure this with a half hitch so that my thread just stays in place. The next thing I'm going to do, and I will just repeat for the sake of demonstration, I take a piece of styrofoam, just waste styrofoam, and before going any further, I would take my rabbit strip that I have already pre-cut at about, like I said, 3 inches long, turn it over, and about 1 inch from the blunt end, I use my bodkin and I basically pierce that using the foam to keep from damaging anything else. And I've created a small hole in the base of this rabbit strip. I then removed the fly from the vise. And insert while holding the thread out of the way. And actually I could have finished the thread at that point, but I'll just slide it ahead a little bit. I'm going to pierce this through the hook, the hook point, through that piece of rabbit strip. Now remember, when this fly is going through the water, you want this piece of rabbit strip to be facing up. So be very careful that when you insert the rabbit strip onto the hook, you do it in such a manner that when the fly is completed, this material is going to be in this inverted manner rather than on the other underside. So, okay, with that then finished, I can put the hook back into the vise, and notice that this little ball of thread that I put on here becomes a block for the rabbit strip to keep it from going forward. Okay, I can then return my thread to the starting place. And then while holding the hole that was made in the rabbit strip right up against that thread bump, I can begin to make wraps underneath to secure that piece of rabbit strip to the underside of the hook. Another layer of thread down over the top of it is going to secure that rabbit strip right in place, and it's not going to go anywhere. Okay. Now, from this point on, it's basically the same steps that were used in the very first Curly Tailed Jig. Again, I stroke back these portions, the fiber portion of the cactus chenille, lay the tip of it right at the thread, the location where the thread currently is, and after making several wraps, I bring that tying thread forward, and I stop immediately behind the eye of the hook. Again, I will put 1/2 hitch to hold my thread at that position. And then I begin to make my forward wraps with the cactus chenille. Again, pulling the fibers back to the rear with each successive turn. And we could refer to this as the body of the fly or the abdomen of the fly. But as you can see, we're getting a nice bulky abdomen on this fly, representing the silhouette of a minnow, again of a leech, or even a robust worm of some sort. And we're going to bring that material all the way forward, as I did before, stopping just behind the eye of the bead chain eyes. 2 wraps of thread behind this material and 2 in front, and then I can clip off the remainder. And then I'm going to take, as I did before with the Curly Tailed Jig, 4 of these rubber Dynafloss fibers. If we were tying this material onto a type of an insect pattern, we would refer to it as legs. But since fish don't have legs, nor do worms, it wouldn't be proper to say this is leg material. But nonetheless, it's tied in the same manner. And I will tie it in the same manner as I did before, in the event that you do not have a rotary vise. Take the material, divide it approximately in half, make 1 wrap around the material, just slide it up the thread to the bottom of the fly, make 1 or 2 wraps around the shank of the hook, and then you can come back over that material, which is going to hold it together on the underside, which will eventually be the top side of the fly. Now, at this point, I could, since I'm using orange thread, I could use this as my hot spot, but I tend to prefer the brighter red or burnt orange. In some catalogs, it's referred to as fire orange, to finish off the fly and provide that hot spot. And in this case, I'm going to do that. And a simple clip with my scissors. And we have the Rabbit Strip Jig. Here is the Rabbit Strip Jig that I just completed, the one in olive, one that I had done earlier before this session, also the Rabbit Strip in chartreuse. I hope that you can see the variety of patterns that you can do, all with the same method and basically all with the same materials. As usual, let creativity be your guide. So, I hope that you enjoyed today's fly tying session with these 2 flies, the Curly Tailed Jig and the Rabbit Strip Jig. And so I'd just like to make a few other comments. And I'll summarize that by saying, this is my what, when, where, and how session. So what type of fish would I use the Curly Tailed Jig for? I'd use it for crappie, smallmouth, and even largemouth bass for perch and other types of freshwater species. When would you use this? I'd use this at this time of year right now, summer through fall, the warmer months, when you have less tendency to be fishing for trout because of the time of the year and the warm water, and also the abundance of other types of bait that the that the fish would be keying on, particularly smallmouth bass. Where and how, okay? I would be fishing this type of fly in a river, in a stream, or even in a pond. Fishing it either alone or perhaps in a pond with some sort of a buoyant bobber, such as a thingamabobber that we commonly use sometimes to suspend one of our flies, like a nymph, off of the bottom. In deeper waters, consider using this type of fly with intermediate or sink tip line in order to get the Curly Tailed Jig or the Rabbit Strip Jig down into the strike zone. If you're fishing from a kayak or canoe, just slowly paddle or row your watercraft along weed beds. And the slow motion of you stroking either the canoe paddle or the kayak paddles will create that natural jigging of the fly that entices the fish to strike. So I hope that you've learned something today about tying this type of fly, and that the procedures that we use, which are applicable not only to tying a variety of these types of jig flies, but can also be used virtually anytime you're tying a streamer fly, a streamer pattern, something like that. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you on the stream.